Pesachim, Daf Tzadi through Tzadi Vav. On Daf Tzadi, the Gemara brings a brisa, Kidatanya, Kol Chai B'Tfilas, Tfilasan Bayom. All women who have to be tovelas in a mikvah, their tefillah is during the day, except Nida v'Yoledes, two women, a woman who's a Nida, a woman who's a Yoledes, who gives birth, Tfilasan Balayla, their tefillah is not to be done until the evening. Why? Gemara brings another brisa that explains, Tanya, Yachal Te Tovelas in Bod Yom. We would think a Nida can be tovelas, can go to the mikvah during the day. Talmud Lomar, Shivas Yomim Tiyeh B'Nidasa, the woman remains a Nida for 7 days. The Gemara darshans, Tehei B'Nidasa Kol Shiva, the Nida status, the Tumah status remains upon her for the full 7 days, so until the end of the 7th day she cannot be tovelas. And Violedes, Iskish Nida, a woman who gives birth, is compared in the Torah, is Hukash to a Nida. So, Midaraisa, a woman who's a Nida, needs to wait 7 days, doesn't have to be 7 clean days. She can see for 2 days, 3 days, 6 days, and then at the end of the 7 days, she just goes to the mikvah. She doesn't need 7 clean days, but she has to wait, Midaraisa, until the end of the 7th day, because her Nida status adheres to her for the full 7 days. We also, Bizman Hazeh, we also are not generally tovlos, women are not tovlos during the day, but that's for a completely different reason. We treat our women as zavos. The women treat themselves as zava gedola. B'nos Yisrael achmiru al atzman. The Gemara brings this chumrah. So we say that it's not enough to just wait 7 days from the onset of the period. You need 7 clean days. The 7 clean days are counted beginning with the next day, the day after her period ceases. She gets a hefsek tara and starts counting Zayin Nikim the next day. They have to be 7 consecutive clean days. And she's tovelas at the end of 7 clean days, which is going to be at least 1 day later than the end of the 7 days. Because our normal woman who's a Nida, she sees on the first day and she's tovelas at the end of the 7th day, including that first day. But the woman who's a Zava doesn't count the first day, counts 7 clean days, and then really she could be tovelas during the day of the last of her clean days. That really she doesn't have to wait till the night. But there's a Gzera Drabanan, the Gemara explains elsewhere, there's a Gzera Drabanan, she should not be tovelas until the night. So our women, whenever a woman has a period, we're machmer both for Nida and for Ziva. So she has to wait 7 clean days, beginning with the next day, the day after she stops seeing, and that's always going to be 7 days after the onset of the period as well. But it's longer generally, much longer. It's 7 clean days from the end of the period. At that point, certainly 7 days have passed from the onset of the period, so the din daraisa of our Gemara is certainly satisfied. So midaraisa she could be tovelas on the 7th of her Zayin Nikim, but midrabanan she doesn't do that. Midrabanan she waits until the night. So our women as well wait until the night to be tovelas, not because of the din daraisa of this Gemara, but because of a din drabanan. And the fact that it's only a din drabanan has a major ramification. The halacha is b'makom ones, during exigent circumstances, a woman sometimes is allowed to be tovelas during the day. And Rav Asher Weiss indeed invoked that dispensation during the COVID-19 pandemic. He was asked about a case, the mikvos didn't have the capacity to handle all the women under COVID-19 conditions. They want to have a great deal of separation between the women, and they want to clean the mikvah between women, as they do here. So in order to, and some women wouldn't be able to be tovelas, the mikvos simply didn't have enough capacity in that situation to handle all the women under these COVID-19 protocols. So the question was, can they allow women to be tovelas during the day? Rav Asher Weiss said, yes, absolutely. He said he thinks it's a good idea. Given these exigent circumstances, nira pashut, that it's an appropriate solution, he says, that's called an onus. We thought the halacha allows, in certain cases of onus, women to be tovelas during the day. Of course, not to flout the din daraisa of our Gemara. But again, our women are treated as zivos, l'chumra, and the waiting till the night of that day is only a din drabanan. Makam onus, it's allowed, and therefore, Rav Weiss felt that the COVID-19 circumstances qualified absolutely as onus. On Daf Tzadi Aleph, the Mishnah says that Mishiftichu lo tziyah mibeis ha'asurim, someone who is in jail, but he's been promised that he will be released from jail. And so the question is, can you shech the Pesach for him now on the assumption that he'll be able to eat it later when he gets out of jail? The malacha is shochten alein. However, you can. However, the Mishnah adds, Al kulon ein shochten alein b'fnei atzman. But he can't be the only one. We can't only have people in this and similar circumstances. Why? Because Shem Yavi was the Pesach, We're worried that maybe his promised release from jail won't come through, and then the Pesach will wind up being puzzled because he'll be stuck in jail. So if he's the only one, there's nobody else to eat it, he or people like him are the only ones, then we cannot chef the Pesach because maybe they won't release him. On that, the Gemara says, Amar Rabba Barhuna, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that's only true Beis Asurin Da'akum, a jail controlled by non-Jews. Aval Beis Asurin D'Yisrael, if he's in jail by Jewish captors, Jewish jailers, and they promise to release him, then Shochem B'fnei Atzma, then we have complete reliance on their promise to release him, and we're not worried about Kachim and Beis Abtul. If they promise to let him go, then we have full confidence they'll keep their words. Why? Kivan Daftachinu, since they promised him Mapikle, they're going to keep their word. The Chsiv, She'eris Yisrael Yasu Avla V'lo Yidabru Chazav, that the Pasuk in Tzfanya, as my wife reminds me, the Pasuk in Tzfanya says that Jews, the signature of the Jew is that he keeps his word, that he's honest, and he doesn't renege on his commitments. So if a Jew promises, we're assured that he'll keep his word, and you can rely on that and not worry about the Pesach becoming possible. This is brought in halacha in a Chosh Mishpat context, in a civil law context. Even though generally a contract in halacha is only binding if there's a kinyan. If there's no kinyan, no formal solemnization of the contract, a person is allowed to renege, and Beis Din cannot compel him to keep his word. However, the Gemara talks about Mechus Ramana. Dvarim yesh ben mishum Mechus Ramana. A Jew is expected to keep his word. He's considered faithless and lacking in integrity if he goes back, even on a simple verbal commitment. And in the Shuvah of the Maram of Rattenberg, he talked about a case, Maisa, in the day of Rebbeinu Tam. Someone had a son, and he committed to have a certain mohel do the milah. And then, so the Maram says, that the father has a binding obligation to honor his commitment and grant the milah to the mohel. And if he reneges on such a commitment, so he brings from the Rivam, Beis Din cannot compel him to keep his word because there's no binding commitment in the sense of a binding contract. However, if the person reneges, he's over mishum she'eris Yisrael yasu avla v'lo yidabru chazav. He's in violation of this biblical imperative. And what does that mean? The Maram says, mutter l'kroso rasha. Such a person, it's not simply an aspirational ideal. You can call somebody a rasha for not doing that. There's a tshuva of the Maram Mintz based on the Mordechai, where he says that we paskin dvarim yesh ben mishum mechutz ramana. If someone refuses to behave that way, if someone decides to go back on his promise, the shliach tzibur ascends to the migdal, and he says, so-and-so is mechutz ramana, we publicly shame him for being dishonest, for lacking integrity. And then he brings that they've done this, various stories of cases where Rabbanim did this. They announce that somebody is dishonest. They tell him it's your duty to keep your word because it says She'eris Yisrael Yasu Avla, and they would publicly shame him. They would say Ein Ruach Aminoche Menu, and the tshuva goes on. The post can say, in principle, we could even use force against him because even though it's not a binding contract, he's a rasha for doing this, so we publicly shame him. We might even use force where Beis Din has that power. We can't do that, post can say. It's not socially, the conditions aren't there to do that today. But it's a very serious thing, even though the contract is not enforceable by Beis Din, but someone is called a rasha and it's considered a serious avera. Someone, ein rocham noche manu, we embarrass him and we tell him that he's a rasha for not keeping his word. Daf Tzadi Beis, the Mishnah says there that a gershon is gayer be'erev Pesach. We have a Gentile who converts to Judaism on Erev Pesach. Beishamai Omrim Tovil v'ochel es Pischol Erev. He goes to the mikvah and he can eat his Pesach that evening. Beis Hillel says a parish min ha'arlok, a parish min ha'kever, that it's like he's tamei and he can't just eat his Pesach that evening. The Gemara explains machlokas. What's the issue here? Amar Rabbi Baruch Rabbi Yochanan, machlokas ba'aram nachri. The machlokas here about someone who had a meal on Erev Pesach is about a Gentile who converted and had his milah. Beis Hillel says we can't just let him eat the Pesach that night because Gzeira, that the next year he'll actually be tamei. And he'll say, the year before I was tamei, when I was a non-Jew, and they let me just convert, get my milah and tefillah and eat the Pesach. So this year too, even though I touched the mace and I'm tamei mace, all I have to do is just be tovel and I'm fine. Really, he has to have 7 days of and paraduma water. He doesn't realize that last year he was a non-Jew. Non-Jews don't have the halachas of tumah. So as soon as he converted, he's fine. This year he's a Jew, and his halacha is actually more stringent. So therefore, we're machmer, Beis Hillel says, as a gzeira, that even if he's a non-Jew who converts, we tell him you can't eat the Pesach tonight, you need to wait 7 days. So next year he'll also make sure that he waits 7 days. But Shammai says lo gazrina. However, Arel Yisrael, a person who's not converting at all, who's a Jew from birth, who converted a long time ago, he happens to be an Arel, he needed a milah, divrei hakol, you don't need to wait 7 days, but all you need is tovel va'ochel es piskal erev. You don't have to wait 7 days, but you do need tefillah. There's no gzeira, but you do need tefillah. And that's how the Gemara explains the machlokas. Tosfos brings a kasha the Riva, tefillah. Why do you need tefillah? Where do we ever find that a Jew who gets a milah needs tefillah? Even with Rabbanan, what kind of tefillah is this? He's a Jew. He's not tameh. He's not becoming a ger. He just needs a milah. So he got a milah. So why on earth should you need tefillah? So the Tosfos leaves that question up in the air. Tosfos doesn't really have a teretz. The Radvaz has a long tshuva in which he discusses our sugya, and he says that you have to say, according to the Riva, that the pshat in our Gemara is that an Arel Yisrael who was tameh when he was an Arel, and then he needs tefillah. He needs tefillah because of the tumah, not because of the milah, but because of the tumah. But in Chinami, the Tosfos says b'shem the Riva that there's no real requirement for a Jew who has a milah to need even tefillah. He certainly doesn't need paraduma. He doesn't even need tefillah. And the tefillah is only if he happened to become tameh. But someone who had milah doesn't need, just because he had milah, doesn't mean he needs tefillah to have all the privileges of a Jew who has milah. The Radvaz is discussing the question of the Bnei HaAnusim, discussing conversos who had converted to Christianity, and then they or their children were returning to Judaism. The question, and they have to have a milah because they were raised as Gentiles. The question is, do they need tefillah? Do we have the halachos of gerus? Do they need tefillah? So this is a discussion of the Rishonim, whether someone who was not keeping Torah mitzvahs, whether someone who was a Meshumad, who acted as a Christian, various types of people who return to the fold, who return to Jewish observance, whether they need tefillah. So there's a discussion about it in various Rishonim. The halacha is that some Rishonim say they don't need tefillah at all. Some Rishonim say they do need tefillah, but the tefillah is midrabanan, the Ramah Paskins and Shulchan Aruch. Yisrael Mumar Shasa Tshuva, a Yisrael who is an apostate who does tshuva. Einav Tzarech Litzval, Midoraisi doesn't need tefillah, he returns, he's considered a Jew in good standing again. Midrabanan Yesh Lo Litzval, Midrabanan, he does tefillah. Rishonim say it's a form of tshuva, and it's a form of that the Rishonim say it's Midrabanan, Mishum Maila. It's just a mark and to show that he's returning to Judaism. Amikurdin, you don't need tefillah. There's no requirement for tefillah. The Radvaz discusses this question at length, and he discusses whether there's any raya from the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Haparish min ha." Beis Hillel says, "Haparish min ha arlik, haparish min ha kever." Sounds like you do need tefillah again. The Radvaz himself says that we're talking about tumah over here, and that's really only the gabe, the halachos of covering Pesach. The Radvaz goes back and forth, but he also concludes that you don't really need tefillah me'ikar adin. His conclusion is that Arel Yisrael doesn't need tefillah at all, as the Riva says, except for that Arel Yisrael, who just happened not to have a milah, and then gets a milah, doesn't need tefillah at all, he says. An Arel who's a non-Jew needs tefillah min Torah, that's part of the gerus process. The Bnei HaMumrim, the sons of the conversos, they need tefillah midrabanan. Someone who is not keeping Torah mitzvahs needs tefillah midrabanan, he says. But it's just a din drabanan, and that's how we paskin. That's our Ramah Paskins and Shulchan Aruch, that someone who returns, at least in the case when he returns from being a mumar, from being an apostate, he needs tefillah, but it's only a din drabanan, and it's a maila. It's to show that he's returning to kedusha. Other Rishonim say we shouldn't be so strict with him. We shouldn't treat him like a full-blown ger. We don't want to scare him and to distress him any further, he says. Because really, the milah and the tefillah they had when Jews converted centuries ago, that still works. The fact that he lapsed doesn't take away the status of a Jew. So really, you don't need milah or tefillah. But there is this milah, some Rishonim bring, and that's how we paskin that midrabanan l'chatchila he should be tova. On Daf Tzadi Gimel, the Gemara discusses the Mishnah. The Gemara discusses the rules of Pesach Sheni. The Mishnah says ezui derech rechoka. The Gemara says that a person who is b'derech rechoka, who's far away from the harabayis, or who's tameh, doesn't bring the carbon on Pesach Rishon, is pater and brings it on Pesach Sheni, and he's pater for not bringing it on Pesach Rishon. What is derech rechoka? The Mishnah brings machlokas. The first opinion says min hamodiyim v'lachutz uchmidasul chal ruach, a radius around Yerushalayim from the harabayis to a place called Modiyim. That's Rabbi Kiva's shita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Me'as Kupas Adar V'lachutz. You don't even have to be that far away. Once you're outside Bazar, that's called Derech Rechoka. So it's Machlokes Tanaim, and the Gemara goes on and explains the Shittim in Modim Yerushalayim. How far away is it? It's a time that it takes. It's a time it's a distance of 15 milin, 15 mil. A mil is 2,000 amos. So a mil is approximately 60% to 80% or so of a mile. So 15 mil. Where do we get that number? Why is that called Derech Rechoka? So the Gemara explains that a person can walk 30 mil in a day, 15 mil in half a day. The Zman of Shitas HaPesach is from Chatzos until the evening, so the Zman of Shitas HaPesach is half a day. So if at the beginning of that point, if at Chatzos, when the Zman of Pesach begins, he's too far to get there by the end of the day, when that's what you have to shech the Pesach before the end of the day, then he's too far away to get to Yerushalayim, so then he is patur. If he's within 15 mil, then he's considered not b'derech rechoka because he can start walking then and he can get there by the end of the day. There's a very interesting discussion in various 20th century poskim as to whether this halacha has implications in contemporary times. We don't bring the Karim Pesach, but there was a great debate for the last couple of centuries of whether we could. Rashi Hirsch Kalisher and some poskim felt that we could. In principle, Pesach can be brought b'tumah, so tumah is not a problem. Makriv enough to be shein bayis, you don't need the Beis HaMikdash. So there were those who argued that we could bring the Karim Pesach today. Others argue that we can't. Others raise numerous halachic problems, reasons why we can't bring the Karim Pesach, and then the problem is that for much of Jewish history, politically we couldn't. It was impossible. We didn't have the power to bring the Karim Pesach. So in practice, we don't bring the Karim Pesach. But the question is, if we could, and we don't, maybe it would be better to avoid being near the coastal, to avoid being near the Har HaBayis on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. And there were a small handful of Achronim who apparently considered this a real consideration. The Yisrael Tshuva says that's why some Gedolim lived in Sfas, others were criticized them. They said, why don't you live in Yerushalayim? And he said, because there's a concern that if you're in Yerushalayim, maybe you have an obligation to bring the Karim Pesach if you're there on Erev Pesach. So they want it to be 15 mil away, at least on Erev Pesach. The story is told of Reb Aaron of Belz, Reb Aaron Rekeach of Belz, that he deliberately wanted not to live in Yerushalayim, he wanted to live in Tel Aviv, and he emphatically asked his Hasidim when he first came to Eretz Yisrael to find him an apartment in Tel Aviv before Pesach. He didn't want to be in Yerushalayim for Pesach. He didn't want to have any question of being within 15 mil on Erev Pesach. The Rav Shmuel Eliyahu tells about his Rebbe. He says that he used to say that you're not allowed to go to the coastal on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. You'll be within 15 mil because there's a question of the being close to the Karim Pesach. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that from when they liberated Yerushalayim in Tafshin Chav Zayin in 1957, at that point he held, and that was the minhag of Lubavitch obviously at that period, that you shouldn't be Erev Pesach within 15 mil of Yerushalayim to avoid the suffix. Maybe we have to bring the Karim Pesach. After that, in Tafshin Lamed Hey in 1975, he said things have changed. We don't have the ability to bring the Karim Pesach anymore. I'm not sure exactly what changed then, but it's not possible anymore for practical reasons. So at that point, we don't have to worry about being b'derech rechoka. So there were a handful of Achronim who actually felt that it was a good idea to avoid being within 15 mil of the Har HaBayis on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. Many other Achronim, however, vehemently reject this. They say that we can't bring the carbon. There are numerous halachic reasons, and we can't bring the carbon. It's completely out of the question. There's no need to be more than 15 mil away. And some of the Achronim in particular were very opposed to the possibility of bringing the Karim Pesach. They were worried that people they considered hotheads or irresponsible might try to bring the carbon, so they wanted to emphasize that there's no possibility of bringing the carbon. So they said, absolutely, it's completely out of the question, so you absolutely could be there, you even should be there. The Tzitz Eliezer of Waldenberg said it's actually a good idea to go to the Kosel on Erev Pesach and recite the Tukkum of Karim Pesach and pray for the redemption. Moshe Sherbach also says there are so many reasons why it's impossible to bring the Karim Pesach, halachic reasons and so on. So he says that there's no point in leaving Yerushalayim. He says, and it doesn't matter that we liberated Yerushalayim. It's impossible. It's not the minhag of people in Yerushalayim to leave the city. He says, and therefore he says Rav Sternbach, Rav Waldenberg, and others have said. Rav Aviner says it's a chumrah rechoka ma'od. We're not chayav, he says, for many reasons, and that's the dominant view certainly, that the people don't leave Yerushalayim. But there is such an idea attributed to a number of Gedolim that there is actually a concern of avoiding being within 15 mil of the Harabayas on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. On Daf Tzadi Daled, the Gemara continues to discuss this idea of Derech Rechoka, of being 15 mil away. So the Gemara has a pair of questions. The Gemara says, the questions basically are two inverse questions. Is it strictly the distance of 15 mil, or is it the time it would take to travel 15 mil? The Gemara says, what if you are more than 15 mil, but you have the option of fast transit, horses or mules, you can get there within half a day? The Gemara says, no, but derech lo haya, the Gemara darshans a pasuk, that it's an absolute question, were you more than 15 mil away? If you were, it doesn't matter if you could have gotten there in less than half a day, the share is 15 mil. The Gemara has the inverse question as well, what if you're within 15 mil? But you can't get there. There's traffic, there's Gemalim, there's Kronos, you're traveling with your family, Rashi says, and in practice you can't get there within half a day, but you're within 15 mil. The Gemara brings again a pasuk, b'derech lo haya, or lo haya b'derech. You're within 15 mil, so you're chayav. What are you supposed to do with your family? So Rashi says you can leave them behind and you can go ahead by yourself. You're not an onus. So according to the Gemara, in both directions, if you're more than 15 mil away, even if you could get there within half a day, you're patur. And if you're within 15 mil, even if under normal conditions it would take you longer to get there, if you have some way of getting there and you're within 15 mil, then you are chayav. So the Tiferes Yisrael wonders in the 19th century. So in Yirtzeh Hashem he says, Kishanizka, that we'll have the Karim Pesach again. Hashem will enable us to bring the Karim Pesach. Today we have a new invention. We have the Eisenbahn, we have the train, the iron road. We have the train, he says. So then he says, first, initially he suggested the din of Derech Rechoka would be expanded, that we would take, given that trains go much faster than people did in the time of Chazal, we would expand the radius from 15 mil to a much larger radius. Then he said, no, I changed my mind, he said, because I realized, our Gemara said, that even if you have the option of horses, it doesn't matter. 15 mil is 15 mil, horses don't change the equation. So too, the Tiferes Yisrael concluded, trains don't change the equation. That's his assumption. But there is discussion by a number of achronim. What about other halachas in various areas of halacha that Chazal established in terms of distance? And now we have faster methods of transportation. Does the halachas remain fixed in terms of distance or fixed in terms of travel time? So the Beis Yaakov talked about a case of that returning for Netilas Yadayim. He said, the Gemara, we've had this a couple of times in Daf Yomi already. The halacha is you're not chozer if you're a mil away, then you don't have to return more than a mil for Netilas Yadayim. Less than a mil you have to return. What if you have a horse? So then you say, well, for me it'll only take me the time that a pedestrian would take to go a mil. For me it takes me less than that. So I do have to be chozer. Or do you say no? A mil is a mil. So the Ar Gemara clearly says, he says that the time is that the halacha is established in terms of distance, not in terms of time. It doesn't matter if you have a horse. But Beis Yaakov is not sure. He goes back and forth. He says, but the Gemara darshans psukim. The Gemara brings psukim for that about Karim Pesach. Maybe that's a special xeris l'kasav in Karim Pesach. But other halachas that depend on distance are fixed in terms of time, travel time, not in terms of distance. So if you have a horse, then the distance would be expanded as long as it's within the time it takes to travel a mil without a horse. So the distance would be more than that. The time remains fixed. So the time is the invariant, not the distance. He says that no, he thinks that the ikar is kisvar rishona, that the rule of Pesach, we learn from Sukkim, the rule of Pesach applies to other halachas as well, and therefore he says that the halacha remains fixed in terms of distance, not fixed in terms of time. In the Sefer Pesach Hadver, he discusses the question of Birchas HaGomel, where the halacha is that if you travel on the road, and according to his shita at least, the share is a parsa. If you travel more than a parsa, so a parsa is 4 mil, then you say tefillas haderech. So today he says we have a steamship. So we have a steam, either a steamship or a steam or a railroad. He says, it takes less. So if the distance is indeed a parsa, but the time is less than that, he says. So he says that do you say if a person would walk it would take more than a parsa, so that's a parsa? Or do you say the fact that your steam engine is faster than that, so then maybe it depends on how fast it takes you? He brings it to Tiferes Yisrael, who says that the trains don't change the equation, it's fixed in terms of distance. He brings the Beis Yaakov, who says that Pesach, he goes back and forth, whether Pesach is a unique halacha or the Pesach is the same as everywhere else. So he says, Nira Pashut, he says that at the end of the day we follow the shir of Chazal. If it is a parsa, even though it took you much less time, as long as, like the Beis Yaakov says, like the Tiferes Yisrael says, if the distance is a parsa, then we treat that as the shir of Chazal. And additionally, he says because it is dangerous. He says because the thing goes very fast, even though it goes fast, it still is danger. He says, and therefore you should say B'rich Sagom. Rav Avadi Yosef discusses the same thing. He says that what if you travel by bus, if you travel by faster conveyances, he brings all the achronim and he says it's machlokas. Some achronim said that we apply the same rules as this Gemara, that it doesn't matter how fast you go, how fast your travel options are, the halachas remain fixed in terms of distance. Others say that other halachas, at least other than Pesach, do depend on that Pesach is fixed in terms of distance, other halachas are fixed in terms of time. So Rav Avadi says, as he typically does in such cases, he says it's machlokas, and since it's machlokas, safek brachas lahakel, you would not make B'rich Sagomel unless the actual travel time is the share of a parsa, which is the share of 72 minutes. Less than that, even if the distance was a parsa, you would not say B'rich Sagomel with a bracha. Mishnah Berurah discusses this question regarding Tfilas HaDerech. He says that what if you take a train? He says, you say Tfilas HaDerech if it's only a parsa. Mishnah Berurah says yes. Mishnah Berurah says that even if you're traveling only a parsa, you should say Tfilas HaDerech. You should say it very quickly, he says, say it right away, because the Chatchila you should say it during the first parsa when you leave a city. So, and if we count in terms of distance, not in terms of time, so the train will cover a parsa quite quickly. So Mishnah Berurah assumes for Tfilas HaDerech that the halachas are established in terms of distance and not in terms of time. On Daf Tzadi Hey, the Mishnah talks about Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is the 14th of Iyar, the chance to make up the current Pesach if you couldn't bring it by Pesach Rishon. So the Mishnah says, Ma bein Pesach Rishon with Pesach L'Sheni. So Rishon is offered by your rabbi in matzah, you're not allowed to own chametz. Sheni, chametz matzah imel b'bayis, you can have chametz. Rishon requires halal b'achila, Sheni eno ton halal b'achila, zevazet ton halal b'asiyah. The Sheni doesn't need halal when you eat it, but they both need halal when you bring the carbon. Nechal and tzli, they both have to be brought, eaten roasted, on matzah and rorim, with matzah and maror, and dolchen as a Shabbos. We don't bring the current Pesach. The question is, do we have any observance today of Pesach Sheni? The minhag is we don't say Tachnun. It's actually not brought in the Shulchan Aruch, but the Shulchan Aruch lists days you don't say Tachnun. He doesn't list Pesach Sheni, but many Achronim bring that you don't say Tachnun on Pesach Sheni. Now, perhaps the most iconic minhag of Pesach Sheni is to eat matzah. This is actually a somewhat problematic minhag and somewhat controversial minhag. It's apparently particularly popular among Hasidim. Among the Lithuanian Jews, it is less common. They say that the Gaon in general is opposed to eating matzah after Pesach. I don't know if he explicitly said not to eat it during Pesach Sheni, but he generally frowned on eating matzah, not on Pesach. He wanted to show that matzah, we only do it when it's a mitzvah. The Chazon Ish, they say, did not eat matzah on Pesach Sheni. The question also is, when do you eat matzah on Pesach Sheni? The common minhag is to eat it on Pesach Sheni, which is the 14th of Iyar, which is kind of bizarre because you don't eat the current Pesach on the 14th of Iyar. You offer it on the 14th of Iyar, like you offer it on the 14th of Nisan. You don't eat it until night, on the 15th of Iyar. So there actually are some Hasidim who eat matzah on the night of following Pesach Sheni, on the night of the 15th. Some Hasidim eat it both. They eat it they say Hachana is so important, preparing is so important, so they eat the matzah on the 14th and the 15th. At the end of the day, it's hard to understand. If you don't eat the matzah on the 14th, and if you don't eat the Pesach on the 14th, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, why are you eating matzah on the 14th? Some actually eat maror as well. We don't have the current Pesach, but some actually eat matzah and maror. There are all kinds of customs. Eating matzah, I think, has become increasingly common even in the yeshiva world, but it's not a custom that has well-established classic sources. It is a custom, apparently, that is particularly strong among the Hasidim. Among the Litvish, the customs are, among the Litvish, the Litvish tradition is somewhat more ambivalent toward the custom. On Daf Tzadivav, the Mishnah lists various differences between Pesach Mitzrayim, the Pesach that our ancestors offered on the eve of the Exodus, and Pesach Doros, the current Pesach that they offered in later generations. Mishnah says, Ma bin Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros. What are the differences between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros? Pesach Mitzrayim, Mechkomi Ba'asar. With regard to Pesach Mitzrayim, there was a special halacha that it had to be set aside on the 10th of the month, the 10th of Nisan. That halacha didn't apply to the current Pesach of later generations. The Mishnah goes on and lists a number of other unique halachos of that first Pesach. The Gemara says, Minolan, what is the source for this distinction between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros with regard to Mechkomi Ba'asar? It says, D'chsiv, Dabru al kol adas Yisrael le'mar be'asar l'chodesh hazeh v'yikhu. Hashem commanded the Jews in Egypt that on the 10th of the month, be'asar l'chodesh hazeh, the 10th of this month, the 10th of the month of Nisan, they should set aside the sheep for the current Pesach. So l'chodesh hazeh, the Gemara's daresh, this Pesach, zeh mechami ba'asar, this particular Pesach has a unique halacha that it has to be taken on the 10th. However, the Ein Pesach Doros Mechkomi Ba'asar, that does not apply to the current Pesach of future generations. This idea that Pesach Mitzrayim was set aside on the 10th is the basis for the custom we have to call the Shabbos before Pesach Shabbos Haggadah. The Rishonim explain with a couple of variations. Tosfos in Shabbos says that in the year of the Exodus itself occurred on the 15th of Nisan, which was on that year a Thursday, Yom Chamishi, which means they shechted the current Pesach the day prior on the 14th, Yom Revi'i, which means Shabbos of that year was the 10th of Nisan. The Mechkomi Ba'asar took place on Shabbos, and that's why we call it Shabbos Haggadah. Why? So Tosfos explains that when the Egyptians saw the Jews were setting aside animals for the current Pesach, they asked them, what are you doing? So the Jews explained, this is Zevach Pesach LaHashem, because Hashem is going to kill the Mitzri firstborn. The Mitzri firstborn were not happy with this. They went to their parents and to Paro. They said, we're in grave danger. You have to let the Jews go. The establishment said no. So the Bechoros began a civil war, and there were a tremendous number of Egyptians killed in this war. The Bechoros killed a number of Mitzrayim. That's what the pasuk means when it says, "U'makem Mitzrayim beBechorehem," that God smote Egypt with their firstborn. So Kipshuto, it just means by killing their firstborn, he smote Egypt. The Gemara's Tosfos is explaining, according to this drash, that it means he smote Egypt with their firstborn. The firstborn smote Egypt, smote the establishment of Egypt brought about by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's Tosfos' explanation of Shabbos HaGadol. The Torah brings a somewhat less sanguine explanation. He says the idea is again that year was on Shabbos. The Jews set aside the current Pesach on Shabbos. The Mitzrayim again saw, and they asked why, and the Jews said it's because we're going to shech these karbanos. The sheep were the idols of Egypt, so the Egyptians were furious, and then this was intolerable to them. But nevertheless, despite the rage of the Egyptians, Hashem prevented them from doing anything, from saying anything, and that great nace. That's why we call this Shabbos Haggadah. There are various minhagim associated with Shabbos Haggadol. One of them, the Darkei Moshe, the Ramah brings, that we recite the Haggadah. Mincha and Shabbos Haggadol, we say part of the Haggadah from Avadim Hayinu until Chaper al Kol Avonoseinu. The Ramah brings this in Shulchan Aruch. The minhag is to recite the Haggadah, part of the Haggadah on Shabbos Haggadah. Why? Mishnah Berurah explains again. V'shabah Haisa Eschalas Hagula V'Anisim. That day, that Shabbos Haggadol, the 10th of Nisan, that was the beginning of the end, the beginning of the redemption from Egypt. We commemorate that by reciting the Haggadah. Biur Halacha brings that the Gaon of Vilna did not follow this custom. He would not say the Haggadah because it says in the Haggadah itself. The Haggadah brings a midrash. The mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is what we do when we recite the Haggadah, when does that mitzvah apply? So there's a famous passage early in the Haggadah, Yachal me Rosh Chodesh. You might think from Rosh Chodesh Nisan there's a mitzvah to talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. Talmud Lomar Bayom Hahu. No, Bayom Hahu, the day of the Exodus. I Bayom Hahu Yachal mibod Yom. We might think it applies mibod Yom during the day already. Talmud Lomar Ba'avor Zeh. The Torah says Ba'avor Zeh because of this. Ba'avor Zeh lo amarti el b'shah sheyesh matzu amar menachem lefanecha. The mitzvah of the Haggadah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim only applies at the time where you have matzah and maror, which is the night of the Seder. So because of this, the Gra felt that the Haggadah should not be recited at any time other than the Seder. The Rama obviously agrees that the Iker Mitzvah Deraisa of the Haggadah is only at the night of the Seder. He presumably felt, but it's a minhag, so we can add to what the Torah requires. It's a minhag to recite the Haggadah early to commemorate the Nes. And the Gra felt, apparently, as we said earlier, as he felt with regard to matzah, you only eat matzah on Pesach when it's a mitzvah. We don't add to what the Torah said. And here too, the Gra felt that the Haggadah is a mitzvah. The Midrash explicitly says the mitzvah only applies at the night of the Seder, and therefore the minhag of the Gra was not to recite the Haggadah on Shabbos HaGadol, to only recite the Haggadah at the Seder.